Yeah. So before I start this series, I want to point out two things. Number one, sorry about the roadworks. They're going to be in the background throughout this video. They've been driving me insane for months. And number two, there's nothing wrong with looking into conspiracy theories. I know they're a bit demonized and tabooed these days. Well, they always have been. But the idea of questioning things and just not accepting everything at face value is actually quite a healthy mentality to have. But what we see with a lot of conspiracies and conspiracy theorists is they take that idea a little bit too far. Sometimes it does end up being true. For example, the Dreyfus affair ended up being true. And the fact that iPhones listen to your conversations ended up being true as well, which means your mum was right all along. It is that damn phone. But just because some conspiracies are right, it doesn't mean all of them are. Now, you're probably wondering one of two things about this. Number one, what the hell is Tartaria? If you're one of those people, man, you're in for a wild ride on this series because it gets pretty crazy. And number two, if you're thinking, why am I going to watch a 7-video series about Tartaria? Well, guess what? You're going to, because I've got a lot to say about it, and I think, at least, it's quite interesting. But before we get into the bread and butter of the Tartarian series, you've probably got one other big question on your mind, and that is, who the hell is the person on my screen right now? Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Aaron Chandler Blake. I have a master's degree in participatory culture and social media studies with a specialism in investigative journalism, and my thesis was on the evolution of propaganda in the age of digital media. I know that is a lot of very long words, and to cut a long story short, I've got a piece of paper that says I've got a big brain when it comes to media. Oh yeah, I've also written a book as well. It's a science fiction book, by the way, so this theory ties in quite a lot with it, which is one of the things that made me want to research it. Also, sorry about my pronunciation in this video. Some people say Tartaria, other people say Tartaria. To try and keep the crowd happy, I sort of flip between the two pronunciations throughout this video, depending on my mood. Like I said, there's a lot going on with this conspiracy theory, so I will try my best to keep this explanation as simple as I possibly can. Have you ever looked at an old map and seen the word Tartaria written across Far East Asia and wondered why you have never heard about this place before in your life? Have you ever looked at an old building and wonder how people with horses and carts and no modern technology were able to build such intricate, ornate structures? Have you ever seen an old photograph and wondered why there's no people in it, or why the sky is such a weird colour? Or have you ever looked at historical timelines and wondered why there are so many big gaps in certain places? Well, good news, because the Tartarian Empire theory has all the answers you need. According to the theory itself, anyway. The Tartarian Empire was allegedly a very vast and intricate empire that spanned across Far East Asia, northern China, and North America. Some theorists even claim it made it as far as Central Asia, Europe, and North Africa. So what made the Tartarian Empire so special? Well, the Tartarians were special because apparently they had ultra-modern, hyper-advanced technology that is far superior to everything we have today. This included aircraft hundreds of years before humanity invented it. It included free energy that could be harnessed from the ether of the atmosphere. They also had the ability to levitate objects with sound resonance, and they also had healing bells that could cure many diseases. They are also responsible for all of the fantastic old world architecture we see today that spreads across North America, Europe, North Africa, Asia, and many other corners of the globe. And overall, the Tartarians are just really great, good, upstanding guys through and through. So what happened to them? Well, at some point in the mid-late 19th century, the world elite had enough of these peace-loving, goody-two-shoes Tartarians and decided to conspire against them and wipe them off the face of not only the world, but off the face of our history books too. And like clockwork, a massive, cataclysmic mudflood swept across the entire globe and destroyed everything the Tartarians had created, taking all of their people and their technology with it. It's unclear whether this mudflood was caused by the elite or whether it was a natural disaster. Either way, the damage had reportedly been done. The world was now covered in half-buried buildings from an empire that we, the survivors, would never be able to make ourselves or replicate in any way. Some of these buildings apparently include Westminster Abbey in London, the Capitol building in the United States, and Notre Dame Cathedral in France. Taking advantage of the fall of Tartaria, the elite went on an enormous campaign to erase these people from our history. The Tartarian children who did manage to survive this were stripped of their identity, they were stripped of their history, and they were stripped of their home. They were put on an orphan train and they were sent to a new life somewhere around the world. The elite destroyed all evidence that Tartaria ever existed. They got rid of all of their technology. They invented hundreds of years, potentially thousands of years of history to remove any trace of Tartaria, and allegedly orchestrated World War I and World War II as a means to systematically eliminate any remaining technology or buildings that were made by the Tartarians. The buildings that survived these purges were repurposed as public facilities such as libraries or train stations in a way to hide their true value as free energy harnessing structures. This incredible conspiracy somehow managed to remain hidden from the public eye for decades, before it became the talking point for pseudo-historical Russian nationalists in the 1990s, and from that it has snowballed into the massive social media consuming conspiracy that we see today. That was a lot of long words there. I'm very impressed I didn't stutter. If this conspiracy were true, it would be the biggest cover-up in human history. But it isn't. So it's not. So like I said earlier, this is a 7-part series where I'm going to pinpoint every single major aspect of the Tartarian theory, research it, analyse it, and then debunk it one after the other. Hey, future Aaron here to say I yapped about this for way too long, so to save us all a bit of time, here's a quick list of all of the episodes. Old maps are a key piece of evidence cited by Tartarian theorists to prove that the empire did exist. On a lot of colonial era maps from the 14th to the 17th century, it's not uncommon to see a place called Tartaria appearing in Far East Asia in what is now Eastern Russia and Northern China. This is kind of the bedrock of the entire conspiracy theory. If it wasn't for these maps, the rest of the theory wouldn't exist, which is why it's the first thing I want to look at in this debunk series. So you have a big logic hole in this theory straight off the bat. Tartarian theorists would have us believe that the world elite went to such extreme lengths to erase Tartaria from history, destroy all of their technology, wipe away all of their culture, all of their people, their flags, their architecture, their symbolism, even the people themselves, the whole lot gone from history. Yet they've taken an atlas with Tartaria written in it and put it in a library that used to be a Tartarian building, while claiming Tartaria doesn't exist. That doesn't really make much sense to me. I kind of feel like it'd be like a serial killer opening a photo gallery full of pictures of him killing someone as a way to prove that he's innocent. It just doesn't make any sense at all as far as I'm concerned. But at this stage, I do want to acknowledge that Tartarian people do exist, and Tartaria is at least loosely based on a real place. In fact, the Republic of Tatarstan actually still exists today in the Volga-Ural region of Russia. Bet you didn't know that. The Tartar Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a name that just rolls off the tongue, was founded by the Soviet Union in 1920 and existed in that form until it became the Republic of Tatarstan following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the continued existence of the Tartarian ethnic group alone is not proof that there was a Tartarian empire. The same way that there being people from Huddersfield doesn't prove that there is a long-forgotten Huddersfield empire that's been wiped from history. However, that's a conspiracy I would really get behind, so if anyone wants to pick that up, please let me know. If the Tartarian Empire did in fact exist, then why would the entire world, specifically Russia, allow Tartarian people to maintain their ethnic identity and to find access to their history decades later, especially after Russia has gone through such lengths to erase the history and independence of its ethnic minorities? The term Tartar itself was actually coined to describe a group of Turkic people in what is now modern China who made up a thing called the Tartar Confederation. This tribe also existed in Mongolia, and they were very predominant on the Mongolian plateau from the 8th century onwards. The word Tartar is actually much older than the Tartar Confederation though, and can be dated back to 487 in the Book of Song that was written by the Liu Song dynasty. This word was used to describe a Proto-Mongolic tribe that was known as the Rorans, and one group that split off from that became the Tartar ethnic group that we know and recognise today. The Tartar tribe survived well for centuries until they became enemies of another local nomadic tribe called the Kamag Mongol Confederation. The Kamag Mongol Confederation was led by the Borjigin, and they became sworn enemies of the Tartarian people after they decided to poison their chief in 1171. In the long run, this turned out to be a very stupid thing to do, because that chief's son, a man called Temujin or Temujin, depending on who you ask, decided that he would declare war on them and kill absolutely everyone. This man, in future, would later be known as Genghis Khan. After the Tartarians were initially defeated in 1196, they were completely wiped off the map in 1202 by Genghis Khan's outright victory against them, which, like many other victories from Genghis Khan, immediately resulted in a massive genocide. The women were then either executed too, or used as surrogate mothers for his army, or used as concubines for him himself. The children were also enslaved, as were some of the strong soldiers, and they were put into the ranks of the fledgling Mongol Empire. And this is where the term Tartar starts to become popular in the West, due to Genghis Khan's horde invasions of Europe. In these initial invasions across Central Asia and Eastern Europe, the Tartarian people were used as vanguards on the front lines before the real Mongol soldiers on horseback and archers came in and did the job, which again furthered the use of the name Tartarian, because in unsuccessful sieges, these Tartarians were usually the only people defending soldiers got to see before they got completely annihilated. In other words, Tartarians were human shields, so Genghis Khan didn't have to lose any of the soldiers he actually cared about. This was particularly common in the first few years of Genghis Khan's invasions, because in the first few years of the Mongol Empire, his men hadn't started self-identifying as Mongol yet. That title came much later on in Genghis Khan's reign. Tartarian was also used as a derogatory term to describe rebellious tribes who tried to rebel against Genghis Khan's rule. As punishment, these people were also sent to the front line to be human shields, or they were killed. I'm not sure which one was the better option, to be honest. It's also speculated that the word Tartary is derived from the word Tartarus, which was effectively Greek mythology's version of hell. And given the circumstances that most Europeans met the Tartarians under, it's easy to see why they would make that association. Because of these advancements by Genghis Khan in the 13th century, and then the following Golden Horde which followed in the centuries after, most of what Western Europeans knew about Eastern Asia came from these people that had been loosely described as Tartarian, as they came from this area, and that's what Europeans thought their name was. That's what they just called the area, because they didn't really know anything else about it at that time. There weren't really any colonies in that area, there weren't many explorers going that way, there wasn't much trade with that place. They didn't know much about it. So Tartaria just became the blanket name for that area. But what they did, inadvertently, is they tarred several different civilizations, several different empires, several different communities with the same brush under the name Tartaria in their infinite lack of wisdom. So although Europeans described them as Tartarian, the people living in this area were actually a massive mix of ethnicities. I've got a few written here. They were actually Mongol, of course, the most obvious one. Then you had Turkic tribes in there, Tungusic, I believe that's pronounced. And there were other nomadic or ethnic groups in the area too, and there were literally dozens of these subcategories that all just got called Tartarian. And this is made even worse by the fact that back in these days, cartographers didn't generally travel that much. They generally kept to their workshops or to the royal courts that they worked in. It's very rare that a cartographer would go out on the field themselves and make maps on site. What they usually did is they would reuse pre-existing old maps made by other cartographers and just update it with information from the very few traders or missionaries who actually did go to these places. And because of this almost word of mouth style of creating maps, we ended up with a lot of really big glaring errors on old world maps that we now know in our age of satellite technology and aerial surveillance were completely false. But I did do way too much research into old cartographers and old maps across various countries and empires throughout Europe, and I found some common errors and mistakes that are through quite a lot of these maps. I've also included a couple of modern examples as well of errors on maps. And the reason I've done this is because I want to demonstrate the fact that until very recently, map making and cartography have been very difficult things for humans to get 100% right. One of the most famous and most common errors that you will see in these maps in the 14th to the 17th century is there is a large supercontinent called Terra Australis Incognita. Now the reason you see this on a lot of old maps is in this pre-colonial era for Europeans. We had this belief that there had to be the same amount of land in the northern hemisphere as there was the southern hemisphere. And after we discovered the New World in the Americas, we assumed there had to be an equally massive supercontinent in the southern hemisphere to equal the amount of land we had found in the northern hemisphere. And this continent was given the name Terra Australis Incognita. And here's a nice little pub quiz fact for you. The name Australia even derives from the Latin word Australis, which means southern, as we can see in Terra Australis Incognita. However, after more and more explorers went to the New World in South America, also exploring Polynesia, and eventually the discovery of New Zealand and Australia, we started to learn that Terra Australis Incognita doesn't actually exist, and it very rapidly started to disappear from cartography maps after Australia was discovered. So it's very easy for us to see, acknowledge and record the time in which we realised Terra Australis Incognita was in fact not real. Yet when people did the same thing for Tartaria, theorists seem to reject that notion for some reason, and I can't quite understand what the difference is. Next, we've got a really good demonstration of how this almost Chinese whispers style of making maps really played into the Tartaria theory, as they did with a lot of other things that were fabricated on maps at the same time. The case study I want to use for this is the Mountains of Kong. The Mountains of Kong were a completely fictional African mountain range, and they were depicted as stretching the full width of the continent for the majority of the 19th century. The mountains were originally added to African maps by James Rennell in 1798 as a way to show his prediction of the Niger River's course. Over the next 100 years or so, this completely made up mountain range appeared on dozens of maps from over 40 different cartographers all across Europe. The Mountains of Kong even attracted explorers from the west who wanted to climb these mountains, but only once they arrived in Africa did they realise that these mountains didn't actually exist. The Mountains of Kong persisted on maps until as late as 1889, when it was finally debunked by a French explorer named Louis Gustave Binger. Just 1889, that's only 25 years before World War I. As recently as that, in a place where we had colonies at the time, where we had multiple explorers, we had multiple trade routes, a place that we were really well connected and had great knowledge of, until 1889 we still believed in a bunch of fake mountains that spread across Africa. And you think if we can make a mistake as calamitous as that, in a place where we had first-hand knowledge, we had first-hand accounts, we even had cartographers in Africa at the time, and we still made all of these mistakes. How many mistakes do you think we were making about Far East Asia, a place we never went to in the 14th to 17th century? One final example of poor map making by Europeans I want to look at before we move on is a very recent one for a mountain in Asia that has an incredibly unique accolade. And this mountain is called Gangkhar Punzum. It can be found in the small and quite unique nation of Bhutan, and it is the tallest unclimbed mountain in the world. And partly it has kept hold of that title because of Europeans' inability to make a decent map of it for literally centuries. Firstly, when cartographers first went there to observe the mountain, they didn't even get the peak in the right country. They thought it was in Tibet, which is now part of China, where in reality, like I mentioned, it's in Bhutan. And due to the fact Bhutan was still quite isolated from the rest of the world, and Tibet also didn't end its centuries-long isolation until the British invasion in 1904, the peak of the summit wasn't accurately calculated until as late as 1922. Even after this, maps of the area showed the mountain in a different place almost every single time, meaning the first team who attempted to climb the mountain couldn't even find it. Before you say how ridiculous it sounds that you can lose a mountain, Remember that this is in the Himalayas and there are a lot of mountains there and most of them look pretty similar. However, if I was a professional explorer, I would be pretty embarrassed if I lost a footpath, let alone an entire goddamn mountain. Anyway, the confusion deepened in 1986 when the British expedition miscalculated the height of Gangkar Punzum to such a degree that they believed the nearby mountain of Kula Kangri was actually taller by about 50 metres, when in reality Kula Kangri is around 50 metres shorter. All of these errors were made within the last 100 years or so, despite having access to photography, aviation, early computers and other technology that was centuries more advanced than what colonial cartographers had available to them. We made mistakes of all of these methods and resources over one mountain just a few decades ago, yet some theorists refuse to believe that cartographers from 400 or 500 years ago got some details in a continent wrong they never even went to when referring to Tartaria. Tartaria persisted on our maps for so long because cartographers themselves didn't explore back in the day, so they had to base it off other people's work like I previously mentioned, and there also wasn't any copyright back then and there was no such thing as fact checking either. Tartaria was nothing more than an exaggeration at best and a completely ill-informed error at worst, just like Terra Australis Incognita, just like the mountains of Kong, just like the location of Gangkar Punzum and so many other places that magically appeared and disappeared off of maps over the years. Old maps also contradict the notion that the Tartarian Empire was destroyed in one fluent sweep by a giant mudflood, as maps over the years show Tartaria slowly getting smaller. This map by Francesco Berlingieri, for example, titled Geographia from 1482, does not include Tartaria at all. This doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't there, of course, but the big gaps and the huge errors we can see on the map do highlight Europe's lack of knowledge and understanding for the region at the time. Next, we have a more famous example. Abraham Ortelius's Tartaria, or the Kingdom of the Great Khan, from 1570. This map shows a vast Tartaria stretching all the way from modern Georgia to China's east coast. But there are a ton of mistakes here. Japan is the completely wrong shape, the Korean Peninsula is missing, as is Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, Alaska's coast is all wrong and the Bering Strait is far too long. The reason it's so inaccurate is because Ortelius never actually went to the Far East himself and based his maps on Marco Polo's diaries, which were sometimes quite vague. This map by Ortelius, despite being obviously inaccurate to modern observer, was used as a template by other cartographers for over a century. By the time Nicholas Vischer drew this in 1657, we see a more accurate view of the Far East, showing a far smaller area covered by Tartaria. And in 1757, Guillaume de Il's Carte de Tartary shows splintered Tartarian regions, with some areas labelled as independent Tartary and others seemingly under the control of different kingdoms or empires, which shows the possibility that it could have been the name of the geographic region rather than the name of a country or empire. Finally, in 1851, John Tallis's independent Tartary map reduced its influence even further to only cover what is roughly now the modern regions of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, before Tartary as a whole disappeared completely from maps in the 1880s. So how did an empire that was supposedly wiped out by one giant mudflood in one go only slowly disappear from maps over the course of 300 years? It's not because Tartaria is a long-forgotten civilization, it is because Tartaria was merely the label of the unknown. The word Tartaria on world maps was the absence of knowledge, and as our knowledge of that region grew, subsequently Tartaria got smaller. I could make a whole video about old colonial map errors because I would find that pretty interesting, but you most likely wouldn't. However, if that is something you would be interested in, please let me know in the comments. It's something I can look at making in the future. But for the time being, I really want to press on with this Tartaria series before I get dragged down too many rabbit holes. So let's put the history of Tartaria to one side, and for now, let's focus on the origins of the conspiracy itself. Although the conspiracy theory has exploded in popularity over the last few years, it originated in the 1970s as a form of Russian nationalist propaganda, and it was championed by two people, Natalie Fomenko and Nikolai Levashov. I'll go into more detail on Levashov for the Phantom Time Hypothesis episode, but for now, here's a brief rundown on Natalie Fomenko. Anatoly Fomenko is a Russian nationalist and mathematician who originally popularised the idea of a Tartarian Empire in his works The New Chronology. Fomenko started outlining his ideas in the 1970s and continued to do so all the way through the 1980s. His subsequent book series theorised the idea that large chunks and portions of human history have been completely fabricated to suit the ideals of a world elite. People involved in this world elite included the Vatican, the Holy Roman Empire, and even the Romanov family. Fomenko claimed that Tartaria was actually the true historical name of Russia, and it was removed from history books by the world elite to suppress Russia's status as a historically dominant force. In his books, Fomenko also claims that the west coast of America was part of a Siberian American empire until as recently as 1775. So to all those proud American Tartarian theorists watching, just letting you know that the founder of your theory completely undermines all of your national identity. Fomenko also name drops a group called the Russian Horde and claims that their leader, Genghis Khan, was actually Russian, when in reality we know this is a big pile of rubbish. Fomenko goes on to argue that everything from the Neolithic era to the early Middle Ages happened in less than 1,000 years, and that written history only began in the 9th century. He claims almost every major historical event happened between the years 1000 and 1500 AD, and cites a lack of records from 800 to 1000 AD as evidence that these years never actually happened. Plus, he relocated the date of Jesus' crucifixion to the 11th century and believes he was a Byzantine empire called Andronicus Komnenos. You know, I wonder how these ultra-creationist Tartarians would feel if they knew that the founder of their theory was effectively trying to eradicate 1,000 years of Christian history and completely move the birthplace of Christ. Fomenko's books gained traction in the early 90s following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a period in Russia where nationalism was at an all-time high but morale was at an all-time low. The USSR had fallen, and Fomenko came along at just the right time to tell everyone that they had actually been the true heroes of history all along and the West had hidden their greatness from them all this time. Fomenko's evidence, though, as you expect, is pretty dubious, at best. His first piece of evidence is mathematical analysis of historical texts. Fomenko claims that there are significantly less records available for the period that predates the 9th century, which to him is proof that these years never happened as we have no records to support their existence. First of all, hell no, that is just wrong on almost every level conceivable. We have plenty of evidence from all over the world which shows us that there were many events taking place before the 9th century AD, unlike what Fomenko claims. And secondly, there is a very obvious reason why we have less historical records from so long ago. Maybe expecting every scrap of evidence to survive every war, fire and flood that comes along for 1200 years might just be a little bit unrealistic. Just because we don't have these texts and records now, it doesn't mean they never existed. Isn't the premise of evidence being destroyed the entire bedrock of the Tartarian theory anyway? And actually, we have plenty of written records from before the 9th century, like I mentioned, which Fomenko not only ignored, but also proves that these years did in fact happen. Some of these records include, but are not limited to, the Dunhuang manuscripts, which date back to the 5th century. We also have the Codex Sinaiticus. I hope I pronounced that right. Which is the oldest complete biblical manuscript in the world, which is consistent with recorded events that happened between the years 330 and 360 AD. There's loads more too, but I won't get bogged down in those for this episode, but I'm going to put a quick list of them on the screen now. Okay, that should be long enough. Fomenko's next piece of evidence is astronomical records, which he claims prove that several centuries were fabricated by the world elite, when in fact the consistency of these records with our modern astronomical records actually prove the exact opposite. So, as a quick example, the Babylonian astronomical diaries, which are dated to the exact year BM 3212 or 568 BC to you and me, still correlate with modern astronomical records. If the years that happened in between this diary being written and the present moment right now had been fiddled with or removed in any way, then these records would not align. But they do, which proves that all of the years that happened in that time that we claim to have happened actually did happen. So it completely disproves everything Fomenko says. He also claims that some historical events were duplicated to pad out our history books and make up for all of the years that we fabricated in the middle. For example, he argues that the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire and Holy Roman Empire are all parallel narratives. He even claims that the Iliad is actually about the Crusades and the fall of Troy and Constantinople were in fact the same event, which is obviously a complete lie. For one, Constantinople and Troy are in completely different places. Secondly, there's the archaeological evidence, which not only proves the location of these battles, but also proves the year they happened. We know the fall of Constantinople to the exact day it happened. Finally, the most mind-numbing reality of this comparison is the fact that the fall of Troy and the fall of Constantinople have almost nothing in common with each other anyway. The only real similarity they have is that the defending forces lost both battles. That would be like claiming Abraham Lincoln and John Lennon are the same person because they both got shot. Fomenko also has one glaring oversight in his books, which is the fact that history exists outside of the Western Hemisphere. Why would historic empires and civilizations such as the Burmese, the Ethiopians, the Chinese, the Polynesians, the Muslims, the Zulus, the Malayans, the Malians, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, the Chimu, the Australian Aboriginals and more all be completely implicit in fabricating or shifting history purely for the sake of undermining Russian nationalism? And the single most important question of this is how would all of this be achieved by just two people like Anatoly Fomenko claims? But Fomenko didn't even come up with this theory himself anyway, it's based off the works of previous authors. Fomenko's writing is initially based off the very dubious work of Nikolai Morozov, who in turn based his ideas off the work created by the heretic priest called Jean Harudin, who according to the Tartarian theorists would have died over 100 years before the Tartarian Empire fell anyway. So for a conspiracy that claims that timelines don't add up, theirs isn't exactly clicking in like a jigsaw. But the main question off the back of all of this is, if all of these numbers and all of this information doesn't add up, then why is the phantom time hypothesis lumped in with the Tartarian conspiracy theory anyway? It's simple. Fomenko cherry-picked information from old pieces of pseudo-scientific works and appropriated their messages to suit an agenda of Russian nationalism at a time when the former Soviet nationalists really needed a win. It's also just a big coincidence that the territory that Fomenko claims to be Tartarian and therefore Russian includes several regions such as Harbin and Mongolia, which the USSR tried to absorb into their influence on more than one occasion. But imperialist Russian expansion by force over skeptical historical territory claims, surely that would never happen. And besides all this, we need to look at the other empires and civilizations that existed within the territory that was allegedly and exclusively Tartaria. Obviously we don't know exactly when the Tartarian Empire began, but here's a quick little rundown of all of the empires and civilizations Tartaria would have had to share territory with over the past 1,000 years. Firstly, you've got the Mongol Horde, and then you've got the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, the Yuan Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Khitan Liao Dynasty, the Tanguts, the Khanate of Sibir, the Qing Dynasty, the various Khanate states in the Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz and Turkmen regions from the 15th to the 19th century, the Russian Empire, and that's just in Central and Northeast Asia. That doesn't take into account the fact that they were allegedly a global empire according to some theorists, which means they would have had to compete with Southeast Asia, would need to compete with North America, Europe, Africa and more. Plus, the actual Tartar region itself has homed dozens, potentially even hundreds of civilizations over the time period where the Tartarian Empire was meant to exist. All of these civilizations, much like the empires and kingdoms I already talked about, have their own distinct culture, history and identity. The irony of the Tartarian theory is that its supporters claim that history is hiding the culture and history of an empire, while they themselves ignore the culture and history of literally dozens of civilizations. And I know this is only episode 1 out of a 7-part series, but I'm already struggling to make all of this add up. So you're probably a bit confused by that subheading. Allow me to explain. One of the things that makes the Tartarian theory so popular and so trendy and viral on social media is the fact that the lore behind it is actually pretty interesting. Like, I'm a sci-fi author, I've been watching sci-fi films and reading sci-fi books my entire life, and a lot of these elements and storytelling ideas that we've been conditioned to love and enjoy for our entire lives have been very intentionally incorporated into the Tartarian theory to make it more viral and make it more interesting to skeptical thinkers. The Tartarian theory also includes elements of fantasy, mystery, and obviously conspiracy, and to be honest, I can see why so many people are drawn in by it, because it is genuinely very interesting. And if the Tartarian conspiracy theory was a film series, it would be a blockbuster smash hit. But just because something sounds cool, it doesn't mean it's true. I've spent a lot of time looking into this conspiracy theory, and I think all of the people that are gravitating around its circle can be split into 3 quite distinct categories. First of all, you've got people who genuinely believe that the Tartarian Empire was real. If you want to believe that, fine. Maybe by the end of the series you would have changed your mind. Secondly, you've got people who want to believe that the Tartarian theory is true. They might do this because it sounds cool, like I mentioned, and they might look at the world, they see a lot of despair, they see a lot of anguish, and they just want to believe that humans aren't inherently awful, and at some point in our history we were more than this. And then finally, you've got people who want you to think the Tartarian theory is real, so you subscribe to their Patreon and buy their books. For this episode today, I'm only going to focus on the second of those 2 groups. And with an example, I'm going to demonstrate how grifters within the Tartarian conspiracy circles have stolen tropes and ideas and storyline narratives from 20th century fiction to make the conspiracy seem more appealing. My case study to prove my point is going to be what I personally believe to be the best book series of all time, Lord of the Rings. So let's start at the beginning. Middle-earth was created by the godly being Eru Iluvatar, and to begin with, the world was perfectly balanced and symmetrical, fully in sync with the energy of creation. Middle-earth goes through cycles or ages, which are separated by huge cataclysmic events that can wipe out entire civilizations and severely weaken the world. Advanced civilizations such as Numenor rise in glory and suddenly fall into ruin, leaving behind remnants of an empire that are beyond anything the survivors could replicate. By the time the events in The Lord of the Rings actually take place, Middle-earth is already a shadow of its former self, and people are surrounded by cities, megastructures and old world technology they could never recreate. Is this starting to sound familiar? If not, don't worry, because there's a lot more where that came from. Tartarian theorists will often talk about ethereal or free energy, put that in quote marks, that Tartarians harnessed, yet they'll say the knowledge needed to do this has either been lost or hidden. Interestingly, Lord of the Rings also includes mystical old world energies that were once common but are gradually fading, like what we see in the One Ring. The One Ring, by the way, could not be duplicated because there was no one left alive in Middle-earth who understood how to do it. So again, old world technology cannot be duplicated by current residents and civilizations. There's a theme growing here. Not to mention that in Lord of the Rings we also have miracle healing and object levitation, like theorists claim Tartarians were able to do. Plus, yes, there is even more. Lord of the Rings has elements of history suppression following Sauron's defeat, with only a few elite people knowing the full truth of what really happened. Architecture in Lord of the Rings also includes domes, spires, ornate facades, intricate masonry, symmetry and immense scale, much like many of the real-world buildings which are wrongly associated with being Tartarian. In short, Tartarian theory is so compelling because it has taken tropes from Lord of the Rings and other 20th century fiction works and mash them all together in a real world scenario to capitalise on people's curiosity and to capitalise on their imagination, so people who earn and financially benefit from this theory can convince people to subscribe to their YouTube channels, to buy their books and subscribe to their Patreons. So in short, Lord of the Rings fiction, Tartarian theory also fiction. If you're still watching the video at this point, thank you very much for sticking with me, and also I feel like I've more than earned a like and a subscribe. It's very difficult to get up and running on YouTube these days, so I really appreciate any support you can offer. Plus, hitting that subscribe button will allow you to see the rest of the series when it drops. I'm also going to be making other content that isn't related to conspiracies or Tartaria in future, so if the idea of that interests you, again, make sure you hit that subscribe. And hopefully I will see you in future.